August 1942. The air over the city of Stalingrad no longer belongs to the living. It has been conquered by the howl of sirens, the roar of engines, and the whistle of 1,000 tons of explosives falling from the sky. For the men, women, and children huddled in cellars, the sun is a mere memory, replaced by a perpetual, orange glow that seeps through the cracks, painting their faces with the color of the apocalypse. General Wolfram von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4 executes its work with a terrifying, Teutonic precision. The bombs do not just destroy, they incinerate. The city, largely built of wood, becomes a funeral pyre. The heat is so intense it warps steel and melts glass. The asphalt on the streets boils, turning into sticky traps for those trying to flee. 40,000 souls are erased from existence in the first hours, an anonymous sacrifice on the altar of one man's ambition. Below, in the labyrinth of smoking ruins, a Red Army soldier named Alexei clutches his Mosin Nagant rifle. Brick and plaster dust coats his uniform, fills his mouth, and parches his throat. Hunger is a constant knot in his stomach, a dull ache that the meager ration of watery soup can barely placate. The world has shrunk to this slice of hell on the banks of the Volga. His routine is that of a cornered rat, scurrying from one ruin to another under sniper fire, sleeping in fits and starts, with the thunder of artillery as an infernal lullaby, watching his comrades fall, not just to bullets, but to exhaustion, to disease, to simple, sheer despair. The wounded are treated in dark cellars, where doctors amputate with carpenter's saws and the stench of gangrene mingles with that of cordite. German panzers have already reached the suburbs. Their vanguards have even reached the Volga, cutting the city almost completely in two. From their positions, they can see the wide, muddy waters of the great river, the final barrier. Victory seems a formality. For Alexei and the men of the 62nd Army, morale is at rock bottom. Every day is a lost battle. Every meter seated another tombstone in the cemetery their home has become. They do not know it yet, but hell has only just begun. To understand the magnitude of this catastrophe, we must go back a few months. The summer of 1942 found the Wehrmacht at the zenith of its power. After the failure at the gates of Moscow, Hitler turned his attention south. The plan, codenamed Operation Blue, was a daring thrust towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. Oil was the lifeblood of the Nazi war machine, and its reserves were dwindling. Stalingrad, the city bearing the name of Hitler's arch-nemesis, was a secondary objective in this grand scheme. Its capture would secure the immensely long left flank of the German advance along the Don River. But for Adolf Hitler, names held a totemic power. The conquest of Stalin's city became a personal obsession, a symbolic duel that transcended military logic. He diverted vital resources, including the mighty Sixth Army, to this task. At the head of this formidable force was General Friedrich Paulus. He was the archetype of the Prussian staff officer, brilliant, meticulous, an exceptional planner who had helped design Operation Barbarossa itself. But his talents shone in the neatness of a headquarters, not in the mud and chaos of the front. His superiors knew it. They described him as a man lacking in decisiveness, someone who faltered under extreme pressure. Paulus was, above all, an obedient man. His loyalty to Hitler was absolute, unwavering, even when the Führer's orders defied tactical reality. He lacked the audacity or rebelliousness to question a suicidal directive. Intimidated by his leader's overwhelming personality, he clung to orders like a drowning man to a plank, unable to see that the plank itself was dragging him into the abyss. On the other side of the board, in the darkness of the Kremlin, another figure stared at the maps with cold, calculating eyes. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, born into peasant poverty. He was the embodiment of the Soviet iron will. Zhukov was not a brilliant theorist like Paulus. He was a butcher of war, a master of the grand-scale operation, pragmatic to the point of brutality. His philosophy was simple. Victory is all that matters. He did not hesitate to sacrifice entire divisions if it meant achieving a strategic objective. His contempt for incompetence was legendary, and his presence on a sector of the front instilled as much terror in his own officers as it did in the enemy. He had already proven his worth saving Moscow and crushing the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol. He was Stalin's fireman, the man called in when all seemed lost. As a confident Paulus pushed his men into the ruins of Stalingrad, he profoundly underestimated his adversary. The German high command, intoxicated by a series of spectacular victories, shared this arrogance. They considered the Red Army a dying giant, incapable of recovering from the blows it had sustained. And the flanks of their great offensive, protected by poorly equipped and low-morale Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops, were seen as an acceptable risk. It was a miscalculation of historic proportions. September and October became a meat grinder. General Vasily Chuikov, a bulldog in command of the 62nd Army, received a simple order from Stalin: defend the city or die trying. Chuikov took it to the extreme. His tactic was to hug the enemy. He kept his front lines mere meters from the Germans, sometimes separated only by the thickness of a wall. This proximity nullified the Germans' devastating air and artillery superiority, as they could not bomb without risking their own troops. The battle transformed into the Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. It was fought for every room, every cellar, every stretch of sewer. A German soldier wrote home, "We could hear the enemy's breath in the darkness, but we could not see him. We fired at sounds." Iconic buildings like the Red October factory, the Barricati factory, and the giant grain elevator became impregnable fortresses. In the grain elevator, a handful of 50 Soviet defenders held off a German regiment for nearly a week. The grain smoldered. The water in the machine guns evaporated, but they held on. While the flower of the 6th Army was bleeding out in this urban combat, something monumental was taking shape on the vast steppes surrounding the city. In secret, under the cover of darkness and strict radio silence, Zhukov was assembling his pieces for a checkmate. He was not merely seeking to relieve the pressure on Stalingrad. His goal was far more ambitious, far more lethal: to annihilate the entire 6th Army. The plan, christened Operation Uranus, was a masterpiece of strategy and deception. Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky amassed a colossal force on the German flanks, precisely where the weak Romanian units were positioned. More than 1 million men, 14,000 guns, 1,000 tanks, and over 1,300 aircraft were mobilized in near total secrecy. In the Kremlin, Zhukov laid the map before Stalin. In his deep, steady voice, he explained the plan. It would not be a frontal assault, but a massive double pincer movement. 2 Soviet fronts would attack from the north and the south, smashing the Romanians and racing deep inland to meet at the rear of the 6th Army, at the town of Kalak. They would sever Paulus from the rest of the German army, trapping him in a pocket from which there would be no escape. Stalin, impressed by the plan's audacity and scale, gave his approval. The tension in the days before the attack was palpable. Every movement, every piece of artillery dragged through the night, every column of T-34 tanks hidden in the woods was a piece of a deadly puzzle. The fate of the war hung in the balance, on the Soviets' ability to maintain secrecy, and on the Germans' arrogance in failing to see the storm gathering over them. The stage was set for one of the greatest reversals in military history. At 7:20 on the morning of November 19th, 1942, the world caved in for the 3rd Romanian Army north of Stalingrad. An artillery bombardment of unimaginable ferocity, an 80-minute non-stop barrage from thousands of cannons and Katyusha rocket launchers pulverized their positions. The earth trembled. The gray, frozen sky was stained red. Stalin's organs sang their melody of death, unleashing a steel rain that wiped trenches and bunkers from the map. Immediately after the deluge, the icy fog filled with the roar of hundreds of tank engines. Soviet T-34s, their sloped armor deflecting the Romanian anti-tank shells, emerged like prehistoric beasts from the mist. Soviet infantry, in their long greatcoats and with their guttural war cries of "Ura," advanced in massive waves behind them. The Romanian defenses, ill-equipped and with their morale shattered, disintegrated within hours. Panic spread like wildfire. The northern flank of the 6th Army had ceased to exist. The next day, November 20th, the second arm of Zhukov's pincer slammed into the 4th Romanian Army south of the city. The pattern repeated with devastating precision. The bombardment, the tank assault, the collapse of the lines. The Soviet armored columns didn't stop to mop up pockets of resistance. Their objective was speed. They drove deep into the steppe, ignoring their own flanks, in a desperate race to their rendezvous point at Kalach-na-Donu. Inside the forming pocket, at Paulus's headquarters, the incoming reports were confused, fragmented, unbelievable. At first, they were dismissed as local counterattacks, mere annoyances. But as the hours passed, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. The red lines on the situation maps, representing the Soviet advance, lengthened uncontrollably, two deadly serpents closing in to strangle their prey. Paulus, the meticulous planner, was paralyzed. His instinct told him he must act, perhaps pull back from the city to meet the threat. But Hitler's order was clear: hold the position at all costs. The Führer had promised the city would be his. Obedience warred with reality in the general's mind, and obedience won. On November 23rd, near the town of Kalak, the vanguards of the two Soviet fronts met. The tank crews, covered in frost and euphoria, embraced on the turrets of their T-34s. The trap had snapped shut. The German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful and proud formations in the Wehrmacht, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army and several Allied units, was completely surrounded. Nearly 300,000 men were trapped in what the Germans would call the Kessel, the cauldron. Hitler's initial reaction was one of furious disbelief. He forbade any breakout attempt. His deputy, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, made a fateful promise. He assured the Führer that his air force could supply the Sixth Army from the air, delivering the necessary 500 tons of supplies per day to survive and fight. It was a fantasy, a lie born of arrogance and sycophancy. The Stalingrad airlift became a suicide mission. The slow, vulnerable Junkers Ju-52 transport planes had to fly through a dense belt of Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and face Yak-1 fighters. Many were shot down. Those that made it to the Kessel often couldn't land due to bombed-out airfields or the atrocious weather. The actual daily average of supplies delivered was less than 100 tons, a fraction of what was needed. Inside the cauldron, the reality of the siege set in with relentless cruelty. The temperature plummeted to 30, then 40 degrees below zero. The German soldiers, equipped in summer uniforms, began to freeze to death. Weapons jammed. Tank engines refused to start. Rations were cut drastically. First, they ate the horses, then the dogs and cats. Finally, anything that could be chewed. The fighting in the city did not stop. Zhukov increased the pressure, launching constant attacks to wear down the defenders. The struggle for Mamayev Kurgan, a strategic hill overlooking the city, was particularly savage. The hill changed hands countless times, and it is said the earth was so saturated with shrapnel that even the following summer, nothing grew on its slopes. Snipers from both sides waged their own deadly duels among the ruins. Soviet women like Anastasia Stepanov became legends, terrorizing German officers. Every broken window, every pile of rubble could hide a marksman waiting patiently for their prey. Life was measured in seconds, in the distance between one piece of cover and the next. Stalingrad had become a machine for devouring men, and the Russian winter was its most effective accomplice. One last hope emerged for the men trapped in the Kessel. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable strategists, launched Operation Winter Storm. A powerful German armored column attacked from the south, aiming to open a corridor for the Sixth Army to escape. Manstein's troops fought with desperate ferocity against stubborn Soviet resistance and the brutal weather. They made incredible progress, coming within just 48 kilometers of the pocket's perimeter. Paulus's soldiers could see the flashes of battle on the night horizon. Salvation seemed within reach. Manstein sent a message to Paulus, urging him to initiate a breakout from his side to link up with the relief force. This was the moment of truth for Friedrich Paulus. Military logic, his duty to his men, everything demanded that he disobey Hitler and order the breakout. But once again, blind loyalty prevailed. Hitler had forbidden him to retreat. Paulus, terrified of facing the Führer's wrath, demanded an explicit order that never came. The opportunity was lost. Manstein's forces, outnumbered and exhausted, were halted and forced to retreat. The last door had slammed shut. News of the relief operation's failure was the death blow to morale inside the cauldron. Despair became an epidemic. The soldiers, emaciated by hunger and weakened by cold, succumbed to apathy. The last letters flown out of the Kessel are a harrowing testament to this psychological collapse. They spoke of eating dogs, of a feeling of total abandonment. Stalingrad is the mass grave of the German soldiers, one wrote. You are talking to dead men here, Paulus told a visitor. The disaster was not confined to Stalingrad. The annihilation of the Sixth Army and the Allied armies on its flanks tore a gigantic hole in the German front. To avoid its own encirclement, Army Group A was forced into a hasty retreat from the Caucasus. Hitler's grand dream of seizing the oil fields had ended in catastrophic failure. The Wehrmacht had lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, never to regain it. By January 1943, the end was inevitable. Soviet forces split the Kessel into two smaller pockets and began to systematically reduce them. On January 30th, in a final macabre gesture, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. The message was unmistakable. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to commit suicide. But Paulus, the man who had not dared to disobey Hitler to save his army, now refused to obey him to take his own life. "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal," he declared. On January 31st, 1943, the newly appointed Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered to the Soviets. The last pockets of German resistance gave up on February 2nd, ending the battle. The final statistics are of an almost incomprehensible scale. The Axis powers suffered around 800,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured in the entire campaign. Soviet casualties exceeded 1,100,000. The city of Stalingrad was reduced to rubble, an empty charred shell. Of the approximately 91,000 German prisoners who marched into captivity, their fate was brutal. Weakened by months of starvation and disease, few were fit to survive the forced marches and the harsh conditions of Soviet prison camps. Only 5,000 to 6,000 of them would ever see their homes again, years after the war had ended. The legacy of Stalingrad is immense. It is universally regarded as the turning point of the Second World War in Europe. The invincibility of the Wehrmacht was shattered forever. For the Soviet Union, the victory, achieved at an unimaginable human cost, became a powerful symbol of resilience and sacrifice, galvanizing the nation for the long, bloody march to Berlin. The battle became a legend, a monument to Nazi hubris and fanatical resistance. In the ruins of the city that bore Stalin's name, Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year empire found its frozen grave, and the name of Zhukov, the peasant's son who became a marshal, would be etched into history as the architect of the war's most decisive victory.